Welcome to 21st Century Radio. I'm Dr. Zohara Hieronymus. Laura Kortner is our executive producer, and Anita Brockington, our engineer. Over the past 30 years, 21st Century Radio has interviewed the who's who of what is commonly called the new paradigm. It posits basically that consciousness is the field in which life operates, and that the physics of light applies as much to our creative capacity building in the world as it does our imagining and manifesting our own lives in a certain fashion. Joining us to continue this discussion is a woman who has written a book entitled, Do You QuantumThink? Dianne Collins joins us this portion of our program to expand the discussion of consciousness and the life of the world from a broad point of view with particular strategies. Learn how, as she says it is, to live fully, dimensionally, the physical, spiritual, emotional, sensual, and other aspects of ourselves, from as we think to so we become, to how every one of us is constantly reshaping the world and world events every moment. And don't get nervous, it's been going on all the time. With that said, let us welcome to our program Dianne Collins. Dianne, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Zoe. It's so delightful to be with you.
Well, your book is big, really big. It covers a lot of ground, and it introduces people to things we've talked about for a long time, but not everybody has. So first, tell us what you were trying to do when you decided to write your book, Do You QuantumThink?
What I call going from knowing the wisdom to living it. So the purpose of my book, the purpose of my work, and my book actually presents a system of thinking, a system of what I call 21 plus 1. It's something numerologic in me that has me say it that way. 21 plus 1 principles, distinctions in thinking that have us instantly integrate the wisdom so that we are embodying these principles that we know from cutting-edge science and merging with spiritual wisdom and applied in a very practical way to our way of life. So that was really what it has been for me, is that to have the that separation finally dissolve, the us and the them.
The duality, as I like to think of it, yeah.
Mm-hmm. You know, is the thesis of my work, which is that even our thinking takes place as a system based in the prevailing worldview, and that even though we're in a quantum age now, we are still very much conditioned in our thinking.
I think that's very true.
Beliefs and assumptions of the industrial age.
I think that's very true. To look at this fear-based polarization of this global dominance, I think, is the residue of the old paradigm and isn't really the true story. It's just a way of looking at activity, and that's why I like the Buddhists when they so look at there's just motion. And the story we tell of it is what we lay on it. And as you point out, that's sometimes where we get ourselves into trouble. So let's talk about the essential nowness and why you write, and as do all the perennial wisdom teachings, as we think, so we become.
You know, this is something that I think I was born to, in fact, I know it, that I was born to investigate this. Because at a very young age, I realized about the discrepancy, particularly about, you know, the so-called religious people who, you know, and I think, along with Anne Frank, that basically people are good. I know that you feel that way too.
Mm-hmm.
And that somehow there was something gone awry. We're a little bit out of harmonic with that. Because even though we know these teachings, these great teachings, that there was this disconnect. So I went on to explore, well, how could this ever be resolved? How do we ever get past this kind of facade? And so along the way, I came across that, right? That, well, as we think, so we become. Your thinking creates your reality, as it said in the popular vernacular. And I thought creates reality? Well, how does it do that? And if all you had to do was change your thoughts to change the world, to change your thought, to change my life, then why does it still look the way it does? Why do we still have this, what we've basically institutionalized as war, hunger, poverty, disease, crime, and on in all its various forms that it takes, different costumes throughout the ages? And this is what led me. So when you read the wisdom, as you know, in Buddhism, all is mind, and I don't know a lot about Kabbalah. I'm planning to read your books on it, that's for sure. But I know from my own investigations of my own consciousness, as I say, you don't need a scientist or a sage to tell you this, that your reality exists in what you hold in your own awareness, what you hold in your own consciousness. And so as I realized as probably a teenager that the only way that we were going to transcend, to actually get to some resolution of these problems, to stop keeping these problems in place, because that's what we do. We hold them in place through an assumption of that, that's just the way it is.
Right, and we can't change it. But when you begin to see that when enough people, and you see it in all kinds of war-torn time periods, and afterwards when there's a recovery and a rebuilding and a community comes together, and you think, well, humanity doesn't always have to grow from suffering. And I think that's the bottom line about development on our planet. We're going to make a choice. Either we're going to develop because we autonomously choose to, or we get pushed along through suffering, which is just so crazy.
That's exactly right. I ask the question, or I say it, we're going to evolve. Are you going to do it through crisis awakening or conscious awakening?
Right.
I know you're saying the same thing.
Right, exactly.
So when you look at this idea that as you think, so you become, and I think what we have, because of our being conditioned, remember, the industrial worldview, the proclamation of science was only matter is real. Only the physical domain, the physical dimension of life was what they acknowledged.
What they could see and measure.
Right. And so when I say, well, what is the study of physics? They saw it as materiality. So everything is based around the five senses. So if you look at, well, then what institutions evolved from that, derived from that, I should say, and you look at the educational institution, and we don't, in our traditional education, learn anything about mind. We learn about brain because that's physical matter. We don't learn about consciousness because the big shift is going from trying to solve problems through taking actions based in existing circumstances. So it's kind of pushing the chess pieces around on the same old chessboard.
Right, it's using the same cookie cutters with a new batch of dough, basically.
Exactly, and trying to get the make-it-fit world.
Yeah.
Whereas the quantum reality, the quantum discovery, or the quantum verification, we should say, right, of the spiritual wisdom, is that if you realize, well, how do we create anything on Earth as far as what we've been endowed with as human beings, is that we have what I could say the clay to work with is our own consciousness, our own mind, our own habits of thinking. So when you start to look from there and you realize, well, you start to, well, what are the faculties of mind? And I identify in my book 5 natural faculties of mind, which have to do with the dynamics of intent, intuition, which relates to the non-local consciousness, that you refer to. And meditation, which I consider a natural faculty of mine. It's not just, an activity that's good for your health, although it is good for your health. But when you start to now distinguish, well, how does consciousness work? How do we use our individualized form of consciousness, and collectively, if we say, one of the tenets, what you focus on expands, because what you put your attention and intent on will add energy and therefore mass, right? E equals mc squared. They're controvertible, mass and energy. Then if our media, for example, started to focus on solution-based questioning when they're interviewing politicians or pundits or whoever, if we started to have a shift in context based on an expanded way of thinking that is more in sync with these principles, then I think we have a really solution-based world going on, which we need right now. And then the question is, and I'd like to hear what you think about this, so when we talk about the ability of that we do have a collective effect when
question.
we focus our consciousness on the same thing.
No question. And they've done so many measurements with random number generators when specific events happen and it's reported by the media and millions of people are watching it, they actually see the randomness go coherent, meaning when millions of people think whether it was Princess Diana or the Challenger disaster or a war image on television, when that many people's minds see the same image, we're actually drawing down from the imaginal. We shift whether the consciousness is random or coherent. So imagine if we all were envisioning each other richly, envisioning the world without war, envisioning each other with all that you need to survive. No question we would shift the planet overnight. I don't think there's any question about it. I mean, I've always thought that prayer, which is intentional attention, is the greatest power Creator has given humanity, that if we ever really appreciated it, this whole game would be upended in terms of this notion of duality, that we're all separate somehow.
That's exactly it. So when you say, why did I write my book? What's the purpose of my book?
Mm-hmm.
This is the purpose is to have people actually bring this into their awareness in such a way that it literally transforms your relationship to all of it. And I say, well, if you're going to think this is like the same old New Age hooey, then, forget it. Those days are over. And so the whole first part of my book, which is in two parts, part one, Wake Up, and part two, Live the Wisdom, which is the actual system of the principles. But in the part one, Wake Up, where I'm saying, why? Well, the important thing is, why do we need to quantum think? Why do we need to expand our thinking? And it's to be able to bring what you just said into something where you can actually make it relatable in everyday world. So I work with my husband, and we introduce and work and apply quantum thinking with executives. We've actually worked with some officials in the United States, some agencies of the United States government, just at the end of the Clinton administration, at the beginning of the George Bush. And the idea for me, is to be able to have this be acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
So what makes it acceptable?
It reminds me very much of years ago with what was his name? Arthur Kessler. It reminds me of when that captivated the World War II generation. It moved hundreds of thousands, millions of people to use their minds in a more fashionable way. Look, we're going to take a little break. When we come back, maybe you can walk our audience through, as you do a CEO or anybody else, of what quantum think looks like in an individual life, rather than my asking you a lot of questions, because obviously, Dianne, you can teach it to us tonight. So, and then read the book and you can go further. Our guest, if you've just joined us, is Dianne Collins. Her book, Do You Quantum Think? Go to www.quantumthink, QuantumThink.com. That's quantumthink.com. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. So, Dianne, there are so many wonderful things in your book. You know, not only is our mind local and non-local, but intuition is a sacred apparatus of the soul. Mastery, you really point out, is a moment-by-moment activity, and we need to be able to discern what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. And as I think, that's following the path of spirit. So talk to us a bit about how an individual in our listening audience would be able to make use of your insight and how they can go about applying it to their life.
I would love to. Big question.
Of course.
The first thing is to say, right, coming from you, of course it would be. I wouldn't expect anything smaller.
Well, I figure this is great. Dianne knows her stuff, and now I can listen.
Oh, no, I like your questions, though. Well, I think what you're saying, Zoe, is really the heart of the matter, right?
Of course.
Unintended, is that how do you connect to this, what we call spirit, that spiritual aspect of ourselves? And another way we could come at it is to say what keeps us from it. And this is where I talk about thinking as a system, because when I talk about thinking, you know, I'm not just talking about the cognitive mentation. I'm talking about what goes beyond thinking, what we hold in consciousness and awareness. So when you look at, well, how do we get to this expanded thinking if all we're starting with is our current thinking, you know, the famous Einstein, I call it modern-day mantra. The problems we have cannot be solved with the same level of thinking that created them. Well, what do? Well, I'm saying you take a literal quantum leap in systems. So what does it mean? Well, it's what I'm saying is distinguishing how this industrial age view has conditioned us to think. How has it mapped onto our thinking? And then looking at the characteristics of this quantum age worldview and how can we, by our own volition, consciously, with intent, condition ourselves to think. So if we look at the old worldview, for short, I call it, literally called the classical mechanical worldview. Began with 17th century science, and you could say, well, what did they say? They were trying to make organization out of, let's say, the chaos of life, and it gave rise to our industrial age, which has great beauty and genius all around it. However, how did it adapt in our thinking? The world is a clockwork machinery. If you could reduce everything to its constituent parts and then figure out how they work together in this cause and effect, push on this to get that to move, then we could predict and control the whole nature, the whole universe. So when you look at this, that kind of paradigm, and said, oh my God, what is that silently telling us? It's not like we're thinking this. It's in the background, really shaping the way we think and the way our patterns of thinking go. So if you were going to predict and control everything, it's logical that it would have to be either this way or that. So we have all this either or. A physical universe in that physical dimension of the five senses that are ordinary, five senses, we look separate. We look different, black and white, liberal and conservative, et cetera, et cetera. So we can see how we're wound up, literally, in that kind of way of thinking. And even those of us who have been on a conscious path, we have what I call, also a term I borrow from science, least action pathways. The way the energy goes because it's been that route before.
It's like, I often think of when Rupert Sheldrake described morphic resonance, that when one person changes, like a person breaking a new path in the woods, and they cut down the brambles, it makes it easier for the next person. But if nobody else cuts down the brambles, the first people who go through are going to get stuck in the thorns. So,
exactly.
So what you're talking about is when any one of us makes, it's a very subtle shift of how we view ourselves and who we are as divine beings. It literally affects the next person you stand next to and the next person you speak to, even if you're not conscious of the fact that your little subtle shift of understanding will shift to the person at the grocery store.
That's exactly right, because that's one of the aspects of new worldview thinking, of quantum thinking, is that we exist in fields. And the fields are invisible to the eye. Again, we don't learn about, what my intent is going, if I shift my intent, it's going to shift the whole field. It's going to have an effect. We have an effect on one another because our whole education is based around that old world view, physical only is real. So what you're talking about and what Sheldrake is bringing out, and he talks about morphic resonance, where this resonant communication, this instantaneous exchange of energy and information and intelligence, it actually takes place amongst forms, animal forms, human forms. I'll say to my husband, isn't it funny when you see someone holding a baby, right? You're in a public place, and you walk by, and the babies will connect with each other in a different way than they connect with the adults. And I think that's what part of what he's talking about is this morphic resonance. But going back to what you're saying about the path, exactly. So the first thing is recognizing that your thought pattern is taking the same old path. And in most cases, and there's a chapter in my book, The Myth of Choice. In most cases, we are not actually even choosing that pattern of thinking. That many times we have always in every moment the infinite possibility choice of what thought we want to have, where we want to land or hook into. The internet is a perfect metaphor, where we want to click, what reality we want to click into. But unless you can recognize these least action pathways that are functioning, these ways of thinking and being that are automatically there, and I'm saying there's nothing wrong with us. What if there's nothing wrong with us? It's just that we are at the effect of this old industrial age world view that in many ways we've become automatic and mechanical in many ways.
I feel like it's a cul-de-sac. We're at a civilization's cul-de-sac. And we need to figure out that the cul-de-sac is just one little neighborhood. And in fact, there's a way to open it up so that there's, a multiplex, if you will. So when an individual, I'm thinking of just somebody in our audience who says, well, tomorrow I have to get up and I have to go to work and I have to do my job and I don't really want to do it and I'm not making enough money. Give us an example of how that can be changed and how that thought in itself, that very thought, creates the condition that sure enough you'll go to work tomorrow and you won't want to do it and you won't have the money and da-da-da-da-da. Explain to us how pattern of mind creates pattern of life.
Because what you're saying is that thought is that person's reality. So what I'm saying is when you can recognize that if you wake up and you have that thought, it isn't as though you chose that thought. That's one of those least action pathways. And there can be a cultural least action pathway, a gender least action pathway, a religious, of the religion, and all kinds of family least action pathway. So you wake up with this thought that I don't like my job, et cetera, et cetera. Now, from a quantum think perspective, it isn't that we don't have circumstances that we're dealing with. There are circumstances, and then there's the matter of how you're related to those circumstances. And that is where our power of choice lies. Because, and I say it to the kids this way, old worldview, circumstance rules. New worldview, intent rules. So as soon as you wake up and you catch yourself, and I'm saying intent is not the same as positive thinking. Positive thinking is having a positive thought that you try to overlay on a negative belief or conclusion that you think is the truth. Fundamental to this, and then I'll go back to the everyday example, is knowing that in this quantum reality that we live in, there are no absolutes outside of the divine or whatever someone considers to be divine, the void, however you relate to it. In the everyday human world of an energy in flux informed by intelligence, there's nothing fixed and nothing solid. Therefore, and that we, as the observers, what we hold in consciousness or what we hold in intent, I'm using these synonymously, are affecting what we see. I say it this way. What you bring is what you get. So when you wake up and you have one of those thoughts, right, about the day, and you realize, oh, that's what we call an unaware intent. But now you've become aware of it because we're distinguishing it right now. You can notice it, realize it's not the absolute reality. It's not the absolute truth, because when you're quantum thinking, you realize there are no absolute realities in that sense. You can always shift and change it. When you recognize that and you realize, even if I were going to choose a reality, I wouldn't be choosing that thought. That's just one of those least action pathways. It's automatic. I don't know how it got there, and it doesn't matter. That's very important. It doesn't matter. You don't have to give it any more meaning. It's not because, my mother did something to me when I was 4 years old, and now I'm having these thoughts. That's all the old worldview analysis. That's part of what the old worldview thinking has taught us. We analyze everything to figure it out. No, you just notice it, and you talked about being in the now. So you notice it, you're present to it, you interrupt that thought, and knowing that the dynamic of creation for human beings that we have been endowed with by virtue of our divine birthright is that we can create from our intent. And you can create right there and then an intent for the day that I'm going to interrupt that, I can't stand my job, and I'm going to create the intent that and you can ask spirit, you can ask the surrounding intelligence to even guide you with this if you can't come to it yourself. Let something ecstatic, let something magical be revealed to me so that I'm in the experience of enjoyment of my day. Let it unfold. You can have another intent. That I'm holding, that I'm being guided to the exact right work for me. That's another thing going on right now, is that we all do need to find, in this time where we're in this, quote, time of a great shift, it does require a shift in consciousness, individually and collectively. We do need to know these quantum principles so that we know how to manage ourselves and manage our mind, since mind is the reality. That we, an aspect of it, and you can say astrologically, an aspect of it, or you don't even have to acknowledge astrology to know this in your heart and soul, that it's time for each of us to bring forth what is uniquely ours to give. And that means a clue to it is really getting in touch with what it is we're passionate about, what we're interested in, where we want to make the difference, how we want to express ourselves, where we will get the most fulfillment. That is going to be our greatest contribution to the whole, whether the whole is just your own family or whether it's the world at large. And as you said earlier, Joe, what you hold in yourself vibrationally is always emanating out to the world. So you're affecting the world, whether you know it or not.
Right, or whether you like it or
not.
Exactly.
And when you can get yourself into the higher states, into the happier states, into the more conscious, into the now moment states, then you know you're making a contribution just by the state you're holding within yourself.
Exactly. And one of the things, we have to take our last break, is that when you really come to understand that our presence, our very presence, each one of us, is the greatest gift we give to the world. Not to say great inventions aren't important, not to say that magnificent nonprofits aren't important, but when we pass on, people don't say, well, gee, I really miss having meetings with that person, or gee, I really miss their inventions and what new Instead they say, I really miss that person. And so what we really miss is each other's presence. So what I like to say to people who say, well, I don't have a clue what I'm here for, just try to share love wherever you go. And when we expand our hearts through real humility and real compassion, spirit comes in. And I really believe that that's what my newest book is about, is how the ancient Hebrews were shown that very model, that the Holy Spirit fills each one of us when we create a humble vessel for spirit to fill. And then we really know whether we took exit 10 because we felt we shouldn't, and so instead we took exit 12, or we picked up the phone and we knew who it was before they called, or we get a sense about something across the planet and we pray for that place across the world. We'll be right back. Our guest is Dianne Collins. Her book, Do You Quantum Think? Welcome to 21st Century Radio. I'm Zoe Hieronymus. Our guest is Dianne Collins. You can learn more at www.quantumthink.com. That's www.quantumthink.com. The book, Do You Quantum Think? Our guest, Dianne Collins. So, Dianne, in terms of an individual in the listening audience, fortunately, our regular listeners have been exposed to some of the finest thinkers and new paradigm meditators and people who are beginning to really appreciate the power of intention and attention, and anything we observe we change, and anything we think we do, and anything we do affects the world. For somebody who's saying, I get it, I have a spiritual sense, I love God, I love nature, I love the world, I have to do carpool, I have to do grocery shopping, I have to do the laundry, I have to make dinner, I have to take care of my parents, I have to take care of my grandparents. People sometimes just feel overwhelmed by the now and the now tomorrow. How does this consciousness come to help in that sense of the just doing of what it takes?
The important thing is, and this really gets back, because this gets to the heart of the matter for me, is going from, as you just said, the people who are your regular listeners saying, I know all this, and I still have to deal with these circumstances. It comes to, when you master your mind, you master your life. So if you are living, and one of the ways that we've been conditioned to live is in the chronological measurement of time that we still are going to be living in. But when you start to distinguish, for example, And this is one of the 21 quantum think distinctions. Beyond time. There's not a word for it in our language. But when you start to become aware of the concepts of time that we live in, and what the most, the biggest one is scarcity. There's not enough time. And you start to manage your mind so that you're in the experience of the overwhelm or the stress, or I know I should, be the vessel, the clear vessel for spirit to come through, but right now I've got to do all these things for my family. Then you say, what concept of time am I in? The one that I just distinguished actually is the concept that I call I can't be in two places at one time, which of course is not thinking from infinite possibility. So it becomes a question of literally working with these principles as they apply, but it's a whole system. So it's not like, as I said, changing my world, changing my life one thought at a time. I don't think so. The agony of it, not to mention the impossibility. But when you take this whole system leap and all that you're living literally looking from the principles rather than at them from the more limiting way of thinking in chronological time, being at the effect of these concepts of time, having these judgments and negative thoughts that go crossing through your mind and not real, and instead of identifying them as who you are, just noticing that those are just least action pathways. They could be swimming in the field surrounding you that you didn't even choose them. And when you put this all together, though, what happens is it becomes very simple because you literally take a literal quantum leap in consciousness and in the context from which you're living. And so every time you have this experience of overwhelm or this experience, and it is a very real scientific fact that the pace of change is accelerating, and the expanding complexity and increasing choices we have because of our technological advances, that we need to have the leap so that we can learn to live with that accelerated pace and not trying to catch up with it. It's the old conditioning of, well, when I get everything in place, then I'll make a decision. Or let me catch up, I can't get enough done. When you start to think from multidimensional action, that you can take one action and it has many results, you just start to think literally in a different way, and you're managing this automaticity of your mind that's a vestige of this outdated way of thinking, then it becomes easy. So it's something that you actually practice. And in my book, there are actually what I call recreations, recreating the distinction in your life. And they're practices for the mind and awareness, very, very simple. And I've been alluding to some of them. But I'm wondering whether this is answering the question that you're asking.
Well, I think that firstly, there's information, and then there's information, meaning there's words that mean something, and then there's experience. And what I always say to people is all you have to do is give yourself the opportunity to experience your divinity. And the simplest way to do it is simply to pay attention to your hunches and to give yourself the appreciation that you have this capacity, each one of us, to know what to do in any given moment, not just for ourselves, but for the world. And so I'm constantly reminding people that I meet and when I give talks about the power of thought and the power of prayer and the power of good intention. Some people say, well, I'm too busy to change the world. And I say, well, all you have to do is change yourself and you'll change the world. The truth is, when we come into mastery, self-mastery of ourselves, that is a tremendous addition to the planet. If somebody in our listening audience manages to know that anger is just an energy, but to act in anger is a destructive force, and no longer to act when one is in anger, but just to witness the anger until it subsides and one gains composure and then acts. That's changing the world. So that when we talk about war as being outside of ourselves, I'm always pointing out that actually we contribute to that energetic capacity for that kind of destruction by the way we treat each other, the way we treat ourselves, the way we think about each other, the way we think about ourselves. So that the truth is that the whole world is reflected within us. And so each one of us who comes in, at least the way I feel about it, each one of us who comes into this sort of sense of divine compassion for our own unfoldment and divine compassion for the planet's own unfoldment, we fall into this harmonic rhythm of everything being as it is to be when we pay attention. And just by paying attention to it with compassion, I feel we make a change.
Absolutely. And you know what you're distinguishing is the way that consciousness, you know, it comes back to that, the way that we create reality that way. Mm-hmm. And so, I think the important part is being able to access that. Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm talking about here, is that when you master your mind, you master your life. Because when you say, listen, you know, to be able to listen to divinity, to listen to spirit, to tap into that intuitive faculty that we all have, and to be able to tap into that non-local consciousness intelligence field surrounding us, even across, you know, the world, because it's non-local. It doesn't matter where it exists.
As my teacher used to say, it's the everywhere and every when.
Right, exactly. But to be able to do that, we have to become clear channels. So it's saying clearing the static mm-hmm. on the radio of our own being.
Well, you know, when you think about the entrainment of society through this sort of neural visual content, and I'm talking about the news, and having been a member of the media for much of my life, in 10 years in particular, covering daily politics as a whistleblower, I myself became an extremely polarized, dualistic, angry person. And it took really that 10 years to burn that out, to go running to God, literally, in order to find another way. And so I speak from my own personal journey and my own personal discovery to find out that that duality was my own inner war. And that war that I had within myself between my own divine soul and my personality was unnecessary. And so once I was able to stop that, I came into a better respect and appreciation for how holy every human being who lives and doesn't live is, and that all together we are this field of divinity. So I sometimes feel like we're all waking up inside the God body. You know, we're each a cell in the God body, and we're each becoming aware within it.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of saying it. But just imagine if you didn't have to take that long. If you just saw, these are the old culture, you know,
right.
these automatic pathways of this divisiveness, this polarity
of thinking we're separate from each other.
Because you look at it, right? You look at the 99 and the 1, for example. I like to use this because it's happening now. And I say I'm for the 100%.
Me too. I don't even think that's a positive metaphor or accurate at all, by the way.
Yeah, but, you know, it's great that people have a voice, but this is what I mean by the awakening mm-hmm. has to be the awakening beyond the conditioning of
Agreed.
The way there is by protest. Because
exactly.
Protesting is not a solution-based context.
No, and we're out of time, Diane, but I agree with you entirely. And as an activist since the age of 14, I used to say it's not us and them, it's all of us. And if we don't act from love, it doesn't sustain anything positive. So anyway, we are out of time, but I want to encourage our audience to read your book, Do You QuantumThink? You can follow Dianne Collins' work online at www.quantumthink.com. I think you've done a great job of bringing something to the fore that gets talked around, and you've shown people how to do it.